Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Managing the Risks of Implementing E6R2, presented by Rowe. I'm Michael Shoshua, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Missy Lavender, Senior Project Manager at Rowe, Nick Polson, Senior Project Manager at Rowe, and Marina Acosta-Enslin, Associate Director of Clinical Management at Rowe. You can read their full bios on the left side of your window by selecting the Speakers tab. Just a few technical notes before we begin. If you'd like to download the slide deck, please click the Handouts tab button on the left side of your screen. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. Time permitting, we will follow the presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Questions and Answers tab on the left side of your screen. Now let's begin. Missy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Missy Lavender, as Michael mentioned, Senior Project Manager at Rowe. I'm going to kick off today's discussion and provide a brief overview of our discussions for topics for discussion. Successful implementation of risk-based quality management, we're going to refer to as RBQM, is a challenge many in our industry are facing. To understand what it is and how it impacts the management of your clinical trial, this webinar will provide an overview of what E6R2 is, and then I'm going to pass it on to Marina and Nick, and we're going to discuss Rowe as a case study. And really, we're going to dig into the design, implementation, and strategy and discuss common misconceptions and review lessons learned Rowe has learned through the implementation of RBQM. Okay. In 1996, ICH, which is the International Council for Harmonization, they developed the first globally accepted definition of GCP. The goal is to establish standards around clinical research. This standard, we're going to refer to as E6R1, which now we know is revision 1, has been the standard for the past 20 years. During these 20 years, many things have changed really around technology, research practice, and constraints in the industry. Therefore, our guidance needed to be updated. In 2016, ICH made updates and adopted E6 Revision 2, which is what we're referring to during today's webinar. This is our new standard for GCP, and in 2017, it was adopted by EMEA, and ultimately in 2018, the FDA adopted. Of note, in 2013, the FDA did issue a guidance on risk-based monitoring, and this is a risk-based monitoring approach without a real risk assessment. Many sponsors adopted this RBM model, but it was not the full scope of quality management that we'll discuss today. So as you can see on the bottom of the slide, our focus is going to be on Section 5 of E6R2. There were many changes in E6R2, but Section 5 is today's focus, and it makes it explicitly the responsibility of the sponsor, or the CRO delegate in our case, to actively manage the quality risk associated with the trial. Okay, so what is quality? Quality is defined by the absence of errors that matter, and errors that matter are errors that impact the safety, rights, and well-being of clinical trial subjects, the integrity of data being collected, and the primary and secondary results of the trial. The focus on quality helps us focus our work on the important issues and keeps us from getting into the weeds on the minor items. And you will hear this as a theme throughout the presentation, that quality is what we're going to focus on that matters. There are 7 steps in a general quality management cycle, and we're broken it down into 2 phases. These steps are explicitly outlined in E6R2, the guidance document. The first phase on the right hand of this circle is the risk assessment and planning process. The first step is the identification of what is important or what matters, and we'll do this by looking at critical processes and what they will be and identifying critical data points. And then we move to identification of these risks. What are the risks to the critical processes and data we're evaluating? After we identify these, we want to evaluate the risk. How significant is the risk? Is it a high risk, a low risk? We want to focus on the high to moderate risk in these instances. As we'll discuss later, many of these low risks can be accepted or mitigated through protocol updates. The next step is to place controls around these risks. We've identified what's important, evaluated the significance. Now we control the risks that impact us the most. As you move through the quality management cycle into phase 2, this is the quality risk management through our centralized monitoring activities. So we're moving into the how we implement this process. Nick will get into additional details further in our webinar, but the main idea of the phase 2 is to communicate the risks that have been identified, review on a predetermined review cycle, and this will differ for everybody, but the key here is to review them on a predetermined cycle, and then report out on those risks. As just discussed, the goal of phase 1 is to narrow down our world of risk to determine what matters. That was the definition of our quality. And then ultimately, we want to determine how we manage and control them. In doing this, we use a tool called the RCAT, the RACT, R-A-C-T. Many people have heard this referred to as the RACT or the RAM. Everybody will have their own tool or own acronym used. The use of the RACT tool helps us look at the critical processes and data for study to ultimately identify the relevant risk or the risks that matter. Each risk will be reviewed to determine if it's a risk that can be accepted. As mentioned, this is going to be determined as a low risk, or risk that we need to manage and control. For the risks that cannot be accepted or reduced through the changes to the protocol, while other risks will need to be mitigated. So as many people do during beginning stages of their study, we will review the protocol and request changes that could potentially remove risk. That is ideal. The risks that need mitigated, that are not able to be removed, will need to be mitigated. And these will be outlined in our IQRMP and other functional plans that outline these processes to detect and act on these risks. Now that the risks have been identified, we need to evaluate them. This process will look different across different companies, but the evaluation criteria will most likely be the same. We evaluate risk using 3 criteria. Likelihood, how likely is it for this risk to occur? This is highly, possible, or unlikely. Impact, what effect does this risk have on quality on clinical trial? Significant, moderate, insignificant. And then detectability, how difficult is it to determine if this risk has occurred? Difficult, moderate, or easy. Companies may score or level these differently, but evaluation most likely use all the same criteria just mentioned. Regardless, your scoring or leveling will ultimately help you identify the risks that need to be mitigated.
So
I'm going
Missy
to pass
went
it to Nick
over.
to discuss Roe as a case study.
Thanks, Missy. So Missy covered, I think, the kind of overall view of what E6R2 kind of means for the industry. So I'm going to go over how Roe chose to adapt E6R2 from our perspective, with a caveat that every company is going to have their own take on this, and we're just kind of providing Roe as a case study for one way to think about how to implement the process. So the first part of the cycle that Missy mentioned, which consists of 2 phases, the first part of that was risk identification and assessment. And this is the process that Roe has chosen to take to do this. This starts with a cross-functional team meeting to determine what risks we think are important for the study. We felt it was very important to kick off the study, right when we win the work, to get all of the stakeholders in a room to talk about the protocol and what we think the risks are. And when we say cross-functional here, we're talking about a representative from operations, so your clinical team lead, your data management, stats, safety, et cetera. they all come to the table with different perspectives. So they're all going to view risk differently. And we thought it was important that all of those viewpoints be heard when assessing risk for the study. Once we've identified the risks that Roe thinks are important, then we move on to a teleconference with our sponsor. Prior to that meeting with our sponsor, we're going to deliver them the RCAT, the tool that Missy referenced before, and basically let them know that these are the risks that Roe has identified for the study. In that meeting, we're going to review those risks with them, also our evaluation of those risks and that scoring. So ultimately, we can kind of, with the sponsor, come to an agreement on what both Roe and the sponsor thinks of the risks of the study, as well as their evaluation. One of the things, too, I want to highlight as far as how Roe has done the evaluation. So Missy outlined 3 criteria for evaluating a risk, and one of those criteria was impact. Roe has made the decision that if any of the risks has an impact of 3, meaning that it has implications with subject safety or data integrity, that those would automatically be risks that we would want to manage. So that was one decision that Roe made regarding the risk evaluation that may differ from CRO or sponsor to sponsor. After Roe and the sponsor have agreed upon the risks, then we start talking about the mitigation strategies or the reduction strategies. So of the risks that we've identified, as Missy mentioned, there might be some risks that we can eliminate or reduce by changes to the protocol or updating a process for the study. One example kind of in our discussion and rollout of this process that was common was talking about a central vendor, for example. So say your study has an imaging component, relying on sites to do an X-ray and assess that X-ray. If the protocol initially stated that each of the sites would be doing their own assessment individually, one of the risks you might consider is that there's going to be variability across X-ray assessments. That is a risk that you could reduce by introducing a central vendor, a central reader that can look at all of the X-rays and then provide consistency in those readings. So that's one example about how you could reduce a risk through a process change as opposed to a protocol change. Not all risks can be reduced though, so there are risks that would need to be mitigated as well. Once we have determined what Roe thinks the best mitigation or reduction strategies are, we'll again have another meeting with our sponsor so that we can review the risks, review our control strategies, and come to an ultimate conclusion on what we think our risk-based quality management system needs to look like for this particular study. And at that point, we move into our IQRMP, which is our Integrated Quality Risk Management Plan. And I'll show you kind of how that kind of governs our study moving forward once we identify our risks. So here you'll see our circle in the middle is the IQRMP. And kind of guiding the IQRMP is the RACT, the critical data and processes, and they're defining what we think the risks are for the study. That plan is going to outline the risks, and it's going to inform all of the other study plans. So the central monitoring plan, the data management plan, etc. So you can imagine that when we developed our control strategies for each of the risks, different functional areas were going to be impacted differently. So we might have come up with a risk that was related to data entry, for example, and that would be a risk that the clinical data management plan would need to address. So while the IQRMP will outline what the risk is and what the control strategy is, the data management plan could then go into more detail about the frequency and kind of the detail of how we're going to review that risk. One thing you'll also notice in this circular diagram is that these are double-ended arrows. So I've kind of talked a little bit already about how the IQRMP informs the functional plans, but these functional plans also feed back into the IQRMP. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move into how our risk approach mitigates our or adapts our monitoring strategy. So as we're looking at our risks throughout the course of the study, we might identify risks or trends that weren't initially identified in the assessment. So you can imagine that in the process of doing our central monitoring, that we might notice that there is a high number of SAEs at a particular site. Maybe this wasn't a trend that we initially had assumed. So we're going to need to revisit our risk and add a new risk into our IQRMP. As Misty mentioned, this is a cycle. It's an iterative process. So, we're not really expecting that we're going to have identified every single risk that occur for this study initially. So if we identify new risks in the process via our control strategies, we're going to need to update our IQRMP and add new risks. So that kind of is the foundation for, we've assessed our risks, we've developed all of our functional plans to outline how we're going to kind of conduct the course of the study and look into kind of our monitoring of the risk. This is going to feed into our risk-based monitoring strategy, which is the second phase that Missy alluded to in the cycle. So now that we know our risks, we need to start to monitor them. Again, this is going to be a cross-functional process. So each risk had a control owner. So it flowed into a functional area plan. So your data manager, your clinical team lead, your safety lead, they're all going to have their own risks that they're monitoring and managing. Throughout the course of the study, they're going to be looking at those risks, and we're going to have periodic internal review meetings to ensure the execution of the IQRMP. This is where we're going to talk about any risks that have been triggered. So any risks that we talked about that we had a control strategy for, if we're seeing that that risk was realized and we're having to mitigate and manage it, we're going to talk about that risk during this meeting and figure out, are our control strategies working, or do we need to come up with additional control strategies? Additionally, and looking at the third point here, issues and actions are going to be detected between or during these periodic review meetings. So I've kind of already talked about how we can identify issues during the meetings, but there's also going to be issues that can be identified between periodic review meetings. So this is a continuous process, and we are expecting all of our functional leads to continue to monitor their risk. So they won't necessarily have to wait for each one of these internal review meetings to look at the risks. They're going to be looking at it through the course of the study. That way, if there are any immediate emergent risks that occur, those can immediately be flagged and action be taken. Alternatively, there might be risks that issues are flagged, but they can wait until that internal review meeting to dig into deeper. And then additionally, as I alluded to earlier, there could be trends that are seen in this periodic review process where we now identify a new risk, where we need to add a new risk to our IQRMP. And that's our fourth point here, which is that the IQRMP and the functional area plans will need to be updated to support new risks as they're identified. Through our central monitoring strategy, I think this brings us to the part where most people are familiar. Way back in 2016, when we all were talking about risk-based monitoring, this is really where we were focused. Kind of just one part of the overall risk-based monitoring, risk-based quality management system. Roe has chosen to divide kind of monitoring into three buckets, and I'll go through each of those through each of those here. And really, it's an adaptive strategy where, depending on your study and depending on the risk, you may use each of these buckets differently. The first bucket is centralized monitoring, and this is really remote detection of the risk. So we've identified several risks through our risk assessment where we can probably use data to inform when those risks are triggered. So this allows us to detect risk early, to look at trends and to look at outliers. To do this, Roe is going to be using a data analytics visualization platform to help identify emerging risks. And this is going to help us determine root causes and identify issues and corrective action plans early on. This way, we don't even have to necessarily be on site to notice that there's a specific risk at one site that we need to identify before we even get to that on-site visit. And this is ensuring that corrective actions are taken other than through our monitoring activities. The second bucket is our off-site monitoring. And this is remote activities that are carried out on a periodic basis to confirm timeliness and quality of data entry review query resolution, and CRF completion rates. This is really an opportunity for our monitors to do a touch base with the site to ensure that everything is going smoothly. Obviously, they can't do everything that they would do on-site, but by doing these off-site visits, we're able to address some of the concerns that we were able to detect remotely through our central monitoring. For example, if we saw that a site was high in their number of queries, or they were delayed in their data entry timelines, or they had a high number of AEs, those are things that we could have conversations with the site about during these off-site visits. It really allows us to assess the site's overall performance and track changes in the site personnel. And that leads us to, I think, the type of monitoring that most of us are familiar with, which is on-site monitoring. This involves everything that we're used to, which is source document verification, the point-to-point view of source documents to data entry, looking at IT accountability, doing facility tours, talking to the PI to get their kind of evaluation of how the study is going and their oversight of the study, and to identify issues and address issues with the site and their corrective action. So all three of these different types of monitoring have different ways of addressing various risks. And by doing our risk-based quality management system, that's providing us with a framework to determine what type of monitoring is best for this study. There are going to be some things that we can identify via central monitoring that we can act without going on on-site visits. And then there might be times when we're seeing that a site has really high risk in various areas that we've identified either through centralized monitoring or off-site monitoring that might necessitate us doing more frequent on-site visits at a site. So again, this all points towards an adaptive strategy where, based on the risk for a study, we're going to come up with a monitoring plan that seems feasible to reduce our risk, as well as adapting our monitoring strategy based on risk as they emerge. And here, I can pass it off to Marina. So that's how Roe implemented our risk-based quality management system. And Marina's going to talk a little bit about how we manage the change within Roe itself.
Thanks, Nick. One thing that is constant in our industry, and that is change. Things are always changing in our industry, and E6R2 and the adoption of it, I think, has been one of the biggest changes that we've experienced probably since we started switching over to EDC, so in the last 15 to 20 years. One of the biggest risks that we've noted to successfully implementing E6R2 has been just kind of a general resistance to change. Change is always scary, change makes things feel uncertain, and not just with our company, but I think a lot of other people within the industry have felt a little bit of that resistance to change in terms of changing how we look at the way that we monitor things. So we really wanted to focus on this as one of our primary risks to the successful implementation of E6R2, and talk a little bit about how steps that we've taken to really kind of mitigate that risk and manage that change here at Roe. Nick talked to you about Roe's process, so I'm going to talk to you about our approach and kind of our process for implementation and how we were able to manage change throughout this implementation and throughout those steps that we've taken. So first of all, we wanted to put together a cross-functional group of members to form a core strategy team for our implementation plan. Most of you are aware, and as Missy has explained and as Nick has explained, the risk assessment portion and the development of risk mitigations is really most successful when you are able to do this cross-functionally. Get functional leads from all of the functions together in one space to discuss the different risks from their perspectives and come up with this risk plan in terms of what we're going to be mitigating. So we felt that that was the best way to start in terms of the composition of our core team. So we did include members from upper management, project management, QA, stats, data management, and of course clinical when it came time to put together our implementation strategy. One of the first things that we did, and you see here as a bullet point on the slide, is that we wanted to ensure that all of the members of our core strategy team thoroughly understood what E6R2 is, what its implications are for our industry. So we did a lot of background research to start off, not only to see what the regulation means or what the guidance means to our industry and understand the history of it, as Missy reviewed at the beginning of this webinar, but also to kind of get a little bit of insight into what changes have been occurring in our industry. So there were a couple of key sites that we used to help with a little bit of that research, including Transcelerate and MCC, that kind of gave us a base of what that implementation strategy is looking like across the industry. Once we had a pretty good grasp and foundation in terms of what the background of this guidance is and what others in our industry are trying to do to ensure that they're in compliance and to meet those requirements, is we needed to develop a process that we wanted to follow, that we felt would best suit our needs within Row. And part of that process development and the development of our own process maps was to take a close look at what our current processes are. So once we had kind of this notion of how we thought the process should flow and what we wanted it to look like in the future state, what is the process now, and in what ways are they within alignment of each other, and then in where are the gaps? And by doing this process gap analysis, we were able to determine where our staff and where people who are used to working with Row are going to feel most comfortable because, our process hasn't really changed. We're in alignment with what we've always done, and this is what we're still doing. And then able to focus in on where those gaps occurred to help us manage that change. So yes, here we are going to be doing things differently. This is where we're going to be doing things differently, whereas, these processes in this particular, startup map is pretty much the same how you have been doing it. We just have a few changes here. I think that helps the internal organization kind of grasp the concepts and get their head around it and feel more comfortable with the process and the changes that are taking place. Once we had kind of an end-to-end process laid out, and many changes have occurred to the process since the first time we kind of talked through it and put it together, we were able to put together a plan for implementation. Now, the first bullet point there talks about company culture, but I'm not going to talk about that right yet. I'm actually going to come back to that. So first, as I mentioned, we had this kind of idea of how we wanted the process to look, and we took a look at our existing processes and assessed where there's alignments and when there's gaps. Then we also needed to take a look at what systems and what processes do we have in place that can help augment this process that we're proposing. We kind of had this vision in mind where we wanted to develop a process that could be system agnostic, that we could roll out and use with the systems and the processes that we had in place as much as possible. But we did, through this process of looking at what existed and analyzing that, did come to the realization that getting some new technology, using a data analytics system would probably best suit us in terms of particularly centralized monitoring. It would at least make it easier. So the process that we developed, although it is system agnostic, did make us realize that we would need to invest in some technology. Now, when it comes to going back to that first bullet point I talked about, company culture, we did want to keep in mind internally what our culture is and how we need the rollout to look. And we tailored our rollout and we tailored our communications accordingly to ensure that this change was not quite as scary to our staff, and to gradually roll it out to them so that they would have a full understanding of what our E6R2 solution is and why we're making these changes to processes. Even though we feel really comfortable with the way that they work, they seem to work really well, but delivering that message and that understanding of the why. So that moves me to this next little section here where I'm talking about just our internal organizational change management. As I mentioned, we took our company's culture into account when it came to tailoring those communications and tailoring our rollout. So we delivered a series of communications while we were actually still in the process of developing our implementation plan, just to give everybody a sense of the what and the why. So they understood what E6R2 is, why it is important not only to our own business but to the industry, and the implications of that. And let them know we're going to let you know the how, but that is going to come a little bit later. First, we want you to really understand and grasp the what and the why. We also developed some tools and resources. So we developed an internal website for our employees to be able to go out and look at the information. We had a few little resources and tools and gave them some highlights of some items. And then another thing that we felt it was important to do, once we had come to the end of our initial kind of implementation plan, before we actually fully implemented it, was to host a conference room pilot. So we used a study that had recently closed out, and we performed our initial risk assessment and completed a RACT based on the protocol that we had for that study at the beginning. And then we later brought in the actual study team so that they could take a look at those risks that we had laid out and identified and evaluated to get a sense of how our process worked with what happened in the real world. And so what doing that conference room pilot really did for us is it emphasized the fact that we were already doing a lot of this, but not in a formal manner. We didn't have a formal plan, the IQRMP that Nick talked to you about. We didn't have a formal tool really to do a full, very thorough risk assessment. But our study teams were doing a lot of this risk assessment already, and they were just documenting it in different, less formal ways. So it gave us some assurance that this was not completely new to everybody. This should not be a new concept. We're already doing this, and that helped us in our communication to say, look, this is what you're already doing. We're just doing this in a more formal way. We did find most of the risks, if not all of them, and it also gave us a sense that with this new process, it would really allow us to sit and think about and identify those risks sooner than perhaps the active study team had, and give us the ability to mitigate those risks more proactively. That saves on time, that saves on resource, and it gives us a cleaner study with a bit of higher quality. Next, in terms of, again, the internal organizational change management, we wanted to give support for the actual rollout. So we developed tailored training, which was delivered just in time for those study teams that would be impacted. And although the process was designed to be system agnostic, as I mentioned earlier, we did actually select a vendor and invested in some new technology for data analytics for use on studies where that makes sense. We still don't have a process that's a one-size-fit-all. We really want to be able to customize for our customers, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But our ability to be flexible and deliver for our customers based on what their needs are is still very important to Row, and that's very much part of our culture, which I talked about a little bit earlier. So with the investment in this new technology and the data analytics platform that we are going to be using on some of our studies, we also had some technical considerations to address this time, mostly around data flow and configuration. So at this time period, while we were upskilling our internal staff to get ready to conduct their first risk assessments, we had a technical team working with our vendor to make sure that the platform would be ready for delivery as well. Following the launch of a couple of pilots where we conducted our first initial risk assessments on actual studies that we're going to be conducting, we felt that it was important to conduct a lessons learned. So we've already done one of those. We had a 2-day retreat for the core strategy team to take a look and say, okay, we've started this implementation. We've followed all of these steps that we laid out to implement internally within our company, and now we're starting to interface with our external clients. We actually have this into practice now. How is it going? More importantly, where are any gaps that we're seeing at this time? Much like that cycle of risk review that Missy was talking about, we really feel that looking at our plan for strategy for implementation is also an iterative process. So it's not an implementation where we've come up with everything, we hand you the process, and we're done. We want to ensure that we are continuously looking at the process to ensure that it's what's best for our clients, for our internal staff, and that we're delivering as high a quality product as possible. So we took a look back and we tweaked some processes a little bit. We identified some gaps, and we're working to improve our process as we move into the next phases in terms of this implementation. So finally, I wanted to talk about change management externally. Whether you're a CRO, whether you're a sponsor, if you're tackling this problem or this initiative and you're starting to work on implementing an E6R2 solution in your organization, once you have everyone internally on board and everybody internally is on the same page, we're able to deliver the same message to those externally that we're working with. There is a level of change management needed with your external partners. They may not have the same level of knowledge as those of you do that have been working on this implementation for however long you've been working on your strategy. We're still seeing that there are some out there in the industry that aren't quite sure what E6R2 is. What I hear most frequently is, oh, E6R2, you mean RBM. So there is that myth that E6R2 just means risk-based monitoring. And as Missy pointed out, and I think Nick also alluded to, risk-based monitoring is a tool that's used as part of the risk-based strategy, but that is not all that it is. Risk-based quality management is much more robust than that. It's the full planning, whether at a program level or at a study level, and it should be happening at a compound level, really. You want to map out all of the risks that you're going to see down the road and come up with plans to mitigate that. And of course, things are going to change. You're going to find new risks along the way. Maybe some risks that you thought were there will not be realized. But it's a constant cyclical process that we all need to be following. And risk-based monitoring can be a very valuable tool in managing that, particularly when you get into your larger phase 3 studies where you're going to be dealing with a lot more moving parts. You're going to have more vendors usually. You're going to have more countries. You're going to have more subjects. You're going to have more sites. It's going to be a longer study. You're going to have more months. So that's where risk-based monitoring really comes into play, where you can actually see some cost savings. And that's another myth that's out there. A lot of people think, oh, E6R2, that means risk-based monitoring, that means less cost. And that also is not necessarily true. Risk-based quality management is a very robust process. It requires some time from a cross-functional team to really lay out and think about the risks. You saw from Nick's portion of the presentation how many meetings can be involved in just ensuring that you've completed the risk assessment and that you have mitigations and controls in place. So while employing centralized monitoring can certainly help you identify risks more immediately, there are those studies where off-site monitoring or remote monitoring visits may not make sense, and where using a module for targeted SDV, which does cost money, may also not make sense. So you may see costs remain kind of the same as what they were. There certainly are some cost savings to be had, like I mentioned, on these larger trials, phase 3 trials. But a lot of the studies that Roe in particular runs, we tend to not see this as a cost savings. But what it is it increases the quality, and it really uses your resources in a smarter way, where the result is higher quality. So I just, wanted to make clear in this, it's one of those challenges that we're coming across as we try and manage the change of this externally. Something to be aware of is that if you are going to be using a data analytics tool, unless it's something that you've developed internally, that is an additional cost. There is additional cost for using those targeted SDV modules, as I mentioned, within some of our EDC systems. But I think what's most important is that there's a close partnership between CRO and sponsor and other vendors. It really takes all of us, not just on one side or the other, to develop a really thorough, robust quality assessment, risk assessment, and to ensure that those risks are followed and that they're mitigated. Thank you very much. That's the end of my portion of the presentation. So thank you very much, and I think that we have some time now for questions.
Yes, thank you, Marina. Let's move on now to the Q&A, and there is still time to submit your questions using the Q&A tab to the left of your screen. We have lots of great questions already, and we will try to get to as many as possible. Our first question is, have you formally defined your risk evaluation criteria, and what is significant impact?
So I can answer this one. So our kind of team that developed our risk-based quality management process at Rowe had a lot of in-depth conversations about this very question. And we did end up nailing down definitions not only for each of the categories, impact, detectability, and likelihood, but also each of the scores from 1 through 3. And as we rolled this out from the company, we did training on what those definitions were so that when our study teams were doing their risk assessment, they had some guidance. I do think the definition for those kind of for impact and the other evaluation criteria as well will vary from company to company. Just speaking for how we kind of address these definitions for Rowe, there was a lot of back and forth. And I think it's hard to pin down one definition that works for all. So I think you do your best to come up with a definition that you think will work for the majority of circumstances, but you also enable your study teams to figure out what fits within their particular study. You might have a study in a rare disease indication, for example, where how they're assessing impacts differs from how we're assessing impact for an osteoarthritis study. So you really are kind of going to lean a little bit towards your study teams that have the indication expertise to know the true impact. But we did provide them with definitions that are at least a framework to have that discussion on what the impact is for this particular study.
Thanks, Nick. And our next question is, how much time does it take to do the initial risk identification?
Hi, this is Marina. I can answer that one. That's a great question. Initially, it's going to take longer than it should once we get used to it. The initial risk assessment usually is about a 3-hour meeting. We're hoping to pare that down to 2 hours, but it does take a while. We look at all the critical variables, we look at all of the critical data, we look at all the critical processes. It's helpful if all of the team members come to the table prepared and have done a little bit of homework so we can go through it a little bit more quickly. But that initial risk ID process, it does take quite a while, and we want to be very comprehensive when we do it to ensure that we capture any potential risks.
Great, thanks. And our next question, regarding the IQRMP focus at the trial level, how do you roll that down at the site level, or how are the risks at the site level then tracked? Whomever could field that.
So, yeah, I'll take this one. So the IQRMP and the functional plans kind of present what the strategy is overall, and they will kind of outline the process for when certain risks are triggered. So, for example, if we have a key risk indicator that talks about AE reporting rate. And we see that one site in particular has a very low AE reporting rate compared to the other sites. Our plans will outline what our threshold for action is as well as like what our quality tolerance limit is. And they'll kind of identify that when we breach these thresholds, what our action is. So in this example, it might be conducting an off-site monitoring visit with the site to talk about their AE reporting practices, to figure out why they have a low rate, and really digging into the root cause. So as far as how it rolls down to the site level, that's kind of how it rolls down from a process perspective. When we do note a flag like this, an outlier in this case, we do note it as an issue at the site level. At Row, we actually use our CTMS system to track site level issues, so we can note the issue there as well as our process for resolving that issue per our functional plan.
Thanks, Nick. And our next question asks, what software products do you recommend to support and assist with E6R2?
Sure, this is Marina. We actually decided to use a product from a company called TRI called Opera. That's the platform that we're currently using. You know, in terms of recommendations, we don't have a lot of recommendations at this point because we're still in the process of making an implementation. But you know, we do have some kind of homegrown tools that we're using based on data that we're able to pull out of our database. I also have seen other places where they're using different, I think it's spot fire reports and different things like that.
All right. And the next one is, how have these more formal planning requirements affected the initial study or kickoff timelines?
So at this point, they haven't really had an impact as far as lengthening our startup timelines. They kind of are overlaid with our timelines. So you can imagine that when you're awarded work, you have your kickoff meeting. Right around the time that you're doing your internal kickoff meeting and your external kickoff meeting, our teams are also going to be doing this risk assessment. So this process really starts off in parallel with that work. And then as far as kind of adding on your data analytics build and et cetera to that, those are going to be overlaid with your EDC build timelines, for example. So overall, from what we've seen at Row, they're kind of parallel processes that kind of work in tandem. And what we have seen to date is that they haven't really kind of impacted our normal timelines. They've just added another layer of work on top of that. But as Marina mentioned, this is really kind of what we've seen is kind of work we've already been doing, but in a more formalized process.
Thank you. The next asks about the new section added to the CSR because of the E6R2. Asking, have you drafted any CSRs with this new information, and what was your interpretation of the language to put in this section?
So Row has not gotten to this point yet, so I probably can't answer that with a real-life example. What I will throw out here is that QA was heavily involved in the process, a development process that Row laid out. And I think our QA did provide us with some insights as far as when we are identifying risk triggers in our quality tolerance limits, that we do need a way of reporting that our risk management strategy failed. So there will be some discussion in our CSR when the time does come that notes that these were the risks that Row had kind of outlined, and then kind of if we do have some quality tolerance limits that fail, kind of what the reasoning was behind that. So I think Row is going to have to kind of tackle this question when we get to that point, but we do kind of have it on our radar. And then the one thing that it's kind of been important for us early on, because we are in the process right now of setting some quality tolerance limits, is ensuring that we're setting them at a threshold that we feel is reasonable, so that we aren't triggering those QTLs unnecessarily that provides us with more explanation needed in the CSR.
All right. The next question asks, who from the sponsor should take the lead on working with their CRO on risk management?
That's a great question. I would recommend that whoever is the counterpart with the project manager at the CRO is probably the best person. I know that some companies have internal quality management departments, so I would certainly anticipate that that person would be involved, if not taking a lead role along with that main project manager. But we really feel that, as with everything else with the study, you're generally your center point of contact is your project manager.
Great, thanks for that. Our next question is asking, as part of RBQM, is your system also flagging other types of outliers, not just high AEs, but also AEs versus the baseline of other sites?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So depending on what the indicator is, AEs is a great example. You do want to look at high and low. So if we're looking at reporting rates, the data analytics tool that we would use, we would expect it to flag both, over AE reporting and under AE reporting. You can view it as, number of standard deviations above the mean, where we look at the mean reporting rate across the entire study as a whole, and then we're flagging those that are too high or too low.
Another example of a key risk indicator that we're looking at in terms of outliers would be protocol deviations. That will give us a sense of the quality of the site. And depending on what our monitoring strategy looks like, some of our on-site monitoring visits may be more data-driven. So if we're seeing those kind of quality indicators that there might be a quality issue with the site, then that would probably trigger an on-site visit and investigation as to why that's occurring.
All right. The next question asks, can you put your system or process on any commercially available eTMF, EDC, or CTMS?
So I think there are probably several systems that are involved here. As I mentioned before, Row is using our CTMS system to track and document issues and actions. So as trends and risk issues arise, we are documenting those in our CTMS system, and that provides us with a clear way to document both that we are conducting our risk review process and that we are implementing our actions accordingly. That being said, I think there are other systems that are going to be involved too. We've talked a lot about various data analytical platforms, and there are several out there that are all worth evaluating. So that's another system to add on top of this. Some of those systems also do include the ability to track issues and actions there as well. There's obviously also a component from EDC. If you do have a data analytics platform, you're going to be taking data exports from EDC that help the data analytics platform with kind of getting all that data to look at rates and trends, et cetera. So I think this really is looking at several systems and how they integrate as a whole to build your entire process.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on what Nick had to say in terms of the system that we chose to use, at least initially for our data analytics. We chose not to integrate it into our systems. However, we pull data from the various systems that we want to feed into the data analytics platform. That gives us a little bit more flexibility, so that if we're not using our systems that we're used to using, we could still potentially use a data analytics platform, because all we need is the data set from whatever system we are looking to analyze.
Thank you. And on this, an audience member says, from your presentation, it looks like RBM is all about monitoring the risks identified rather than monitoring the sites or trial. And they ask, can you help clarify this?
So the risks help us inform what to look at as far as trends at our site and our subject level. So hopefully in answering some of the questions, that's become a little bit more clear. We've talked about AE rates at sites, data entry guidelines at sites. So our risks are helping us look at what data points within the study do we need to look at to identify risk. And they're going to help us really assess our sites across the board so that we know where our risks are at each site. Some sites might not be overall risky, but we can see that, this one site has a problem with data entry, or, this site actually is flagging several risk indicators, and therefore they're one of our highest risk sites that we need to spend a lot more attention to. And then additionally, we can kind of start to go down into the more subject-specific level, like Marina mentioned protocol deviation rates. So it might be that we see that one site has a high level of protocol deviation, and then when we dig further, we're seeing that, they're all related to one specific subject. So this is a subject level issue where, for whatever reason, maybe the subject has problems with compliance. So our risks are kind of drilling us down to letting us focus on the risks that mattered, as Missy kind of pointed out, to figure out at the site and the subject level where we need to focus our attention.
All right. A follow-up. What is the risk of continuing to do 100% on-site monitoring like before? Is it resource extensive, maybe that's intensive, though shall it remain compliant?
So that's a great question. And I can't remember if Missy addressed this or not to some degree. The way we have been doing things, looking at everything, it is resource intensive. It takes a lot of resources, but we weren't always looking at the things that mattered. So 100% SDV in some cases actually may be the better way to go. There are some smaller studies that are very fast-paced studies. Maybe there's only a few sites and a handful of subjects. Maybe there's a lot of complexity to the protocol, or there are a lot of safety issues. Those types of studies, we're still going to probably do 100% SDV. And we're going to use the tools that we have in terms of our data analytics and our central monitoring to help us focus where we need to maybe put more resource, but we would still 100% SDV. In some cases, they found it's not as beneficial to use 100% SDV because you're looking at a lot of data points sometimes, or just you're verifying that transcription. You're not necessarily verifying the quality of the data itself or the validity of the data itself. You're qualifying the fact that the site can transcribe from source to another. Whether we use 100% SDV or a targeted approach where we're using reduced SDV, our monitors are going to be going out and they're going to be reviewing that source data at 100% to ensure that what is in the source is accurate, that it's contemporaneous, that it fits all of those Alcoa guidelines, and that the site is following the protocol and doesn't have any deviations within the source itself. So I guess basically the reduction of SDV is just taking away that time that's used to confirm transcription was accurate from source to EDC. But not necessarily every study needs to have that targeted or reduced SDV approach. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. Thanks, Marina. And another question is, can you address how R2 has impacted sponsor oversight of the CRO?
I think I'll answer this one again unless Nick or Missy want to chime in. I think the impact has really varied, and I think it depends on the sponsor's level of knowledge and familiarity with E6R2 and whether or not they have their own process in place. We're very happy to work with sponsors who already developed a process of this of their own. Some might even have their own quality management plan and their own monitoring strategy in place, and they request us to develop our plan based on their strategies. More than not, the sponsors that we tend to work with are ones that maybe don't have the resources available or really haven't delved into this topic a lot, and so they're really looking to us for guidance. So that's why it was really important for us to develop a full and robust process and tools and everything so that we would be there to help assist in that process as much as possible. at the end of the day, the sponsor is accountable for everything that happens on their study. So we certainly welcome complete sponsor involvement and for them to even help lead the way in this area when they have the process and the knowledge in place.
Thanks. This next question will be our last one. We had a lot of great questions today, and we couldn't get to all of them, but we will try our best to get back to everyone who submitted personally after the webinar. And the question is, if a sponsor does not conduct 100% SDV, is there a risk to the quality of the data?
Also a good question, and it's a question that we get frequently. You know, when we're doing a strategy and we're approaching it from a reduced or targeted SDV approach, we have been through our process to identify the risks, and part of that process is a very close look at all of those critical variables that are going to be important and necessary for the success of the study. So we don't feel that there is a risk on the quality of the data if we have decided to go with that strategy or that approach, because we're looking at enough of the data. You know, at least every site gets at least 100% SDV, at least on one subject usually, depending on what our algorithm is. And we have a lot of triggers in place from the central monitoring piece as well as from the off-site monitoring piece, so that if we are seeing any sort of data quality issues in the reduced amount of SDV that's performing, it's going to trigger us and flag us if there's an issue at a site, so that we can then increase that amount. And what that allows us to do is focus our resources where it really matters.
Thanks, Marina, and thanks to our audience for attending this Fierce Biotech webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating and Ro for presenting today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded, and you will be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.